everyone to this session on ePedagogy, building a digital lesson. This is the first of our sessions as part of the Dovetail Essentials. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. For those of you who might have missed the attendance register, we will share it at the end of the session again, so that you don't have to spend time filling it in now and missing parts of the meeting. Just some housekeeping rules, same basics as always applies. Your cameras and your microphones have been turned off by default. If you have a question, you are welcome to raise your hand, and we will. My colleague Gilbert will then give you unmute you and we'll give you the opportunity to ask your question. Otherwise, we are keeping an eye on the chat, so you're welcome to ask questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that and respond as well as I can to any questions that might arise from there. So first and foremost, I think there's a lot of people that are wondering, but what on earth are the Dovetail Essentials? What does this thing actually entail, and what are we all on about? So just in short, the Dovetail Essentials, it's a series of 8 sessions that we've identified as critical sessions that will help you grow in your own implementation of digital technologies in your classroom. So it's going to help you transform what you are doing. We looked at the adoption strategy, and we felt that we need to give a sense of what the logical next progression is going to be. So what we did is we looked at all the different training that we have done in the past, and we identified 8 critical sessions that we felt are really going to help you move forward with what you need to do. If you have not registered for the others yet, please note down this link somewhere that you see over here, this bit.ly link. Make sure that you copy it down and bookmark it, because some of you might have gone through this link to join the session. But what happens is all the sessions that we are doing across the province now are accessible on that link. So you can pre-register and join any of these virtual sessions across the province, with the intention to give you the opportunity to join different sessions at times that might suit you, content that you might be interested in, etc., etc. So if you have pre-registered for a session on here and you don't receive the information, you can still go to that link on the day, and the link will suddenly become an active one. So these sessions themselves are going to be repeated going forward. For the time being, just to answer that question, what we've done is we've got the 8 sessions, and they're going to be spread out across the first 2 terms. That doesn't mean that these sessions will not be presented again, and we will definitely look at, if they're not presented before the end of the second term, then we will schedule them to be done again in terms 3 and terms 4. So you don't necessarily have to attend all of them. Obviously, those of you who do attend all 8 of them, we are going to look at having some kind of certificate, etc. for it. We haven't finalized that yet, but we do recommend that you attend as many of them as possible. But that doesn't mean that we should only attend those. We can have a look at the others as well. Right, so that's just a little background on the Dovetail Essentials, and there are 8 sessions in total. We'll share the information on that at the end of the session as well, and in the email correspondence following the session. Right, so when we look at ePedagogy, building a digital lesson, what are we going to be looking at in this session today? So there are 4 key things that we will be looking at. And in a way, the session is divided into 3 segments. So the first one we want to look at is this concept of e-learning as an add-in and not an add-on. And what do we mean by that? The second thing we want to look at is the TPAC model. Then we also want to look at the SAMR model. And then we want to get a little bit practical with these things. And we want to look at a digital lesson plan template. So just to give you a sense of where we're going to go and what's with this session, we're going to pause and we're going to look at a little bit of theory before we get to the practical side of things. Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to understand how this TPAC model feeds into our digital lesson plan template. And the same applies to the SAMR model, because ultimately what we need to be mindful of is this digital lesson plan template is going to help us to try and get this part right. The idea of e-learning as an add-in and not an add-on. Just to give you a sense. So we will talk about what do I actually mean by this first concept. Then we're going to start looking at some theory when we look at the TPAC model and the SAMR model, which is based on our ICT ePedagogy theory, and then we're going to try and bring it back to a more practical thing, so that at the end of the day, when we're done with this session, you will leave with a lesson plan template that you will understand how to use it, and that it will help you to make sure that you turn e-learning to an add-in and not an add-on. So when we're talking about an add-in, what we've seen happen across many of the different visits and many of the different things that has happened is e-learning becomes an add-on as opposed to an add-in. What I mean by that is that the e-learning tool that we use starts becoming the focus. It's as if we teach and then, oh, we can do this e-learning thing as well, as opposed to it integrating into what we're doing. And then we're seeing a bit of a clash. That's what happens when teachers tell you, I don't have time to implement e-learning, but it shouldn't really be that it's taking extra time, because it's part of what we're doing. So the key thing is, any ICT integration, anything that we do is guided first and foremost by our learning outcomes. We should never have it the other way around. Secondly, we need to determine the kind of learning events that could take us to those learning outcomes. So if you bear with me with these steps, first we figure out what are the learning outcomes. So in this session, my learning outcomes are simple. I want you to understand different pedagogical theories in terms of e-learning, and I want you to know how to implement them. So those are the different things that we want to do. Now I know that. Now I need to figure out what are the learning events that can get me there. And then we start thinking about technology. So you'll see it is not the first thing. Then we start asking ourselves, but how can technology help us to actually enhance a learning event? So how do I take technology and change what I would have normally done and improve it through the use of technology? In other words, it doesn't become an add-on to what I'm doing. It actually becomes an added-in thing. I'm not changing the learning outcomes, the learning events, anything like that. I'm using technology to enhance it. And then lastly, this is such an important thing to understand. If we look at this, ICT integration is not meant to replace, but to enhance and to enable better teaching practices. So this is the key thing. There are obviously situations where ICT is going to replace certain teaching practices when we start going to online schooling, etc., etc. But for the most part, the way that you are using it, the teachers across our province, we want to figure out how we can use ICT to enhance and to enable us to be better teachers. The minute that we start looking at ICT as something that replaces what we do. So for example, instead of me teaching a lesson, I will now play a video of that lesson instead of actually being the one talking and presenting. Then we are replacing what we're doing. We're not trying to enhance it. We're not trying to enable something more. When I use a video to add to my teaching practice, so I'm going to show them a 2-minute video on something that I would never be able to actually explain or draw or whatever the case might be, then I am enhancing what I'm doing. I explain something and then I show them a video of it. So a volcano erupting. No one can really understand what a volcano erupting looks like until they see a volcano erupting. So then that enhances it. I can't just explain it. Even I could explain it in as much detail, but it won't give the same value. But if I don't explain it and I just sit back and I say volcano, it doesn't give us the same effect. So very, very important. A slightly different way of looking at the same thing. If we do this, it essentially comes down to the same question that we have. First and foremost, learning outcomes. If there's nothing else that you take from this entire session, then let it be this, that our learning outcomes are always first and foremost to what we are doing. Secondly, learning events. Now, there's different ways of looking at this. There are different theories around this. I'm going to talk about what I mean by learning events, because some of you might be looking at that thinking, I did my studies a long time ago. I don't really know what this guy's talking about. I mean, I'll explain that learning events in a second and why it's a nice way of looking at it and understanding. And then ultimately, remember, all of this is building up towards us understanding how we can use the lesson plan, the practical side of things that I'm going to give you at the end of the session. So bear with me, learning outcomes, and then we ask ourselves, so what learning events will help me to reach these learning outcomes? And then I ask myself, what technology can I use to enhance the learning events? Right. So it's the same principle as we saw in the previous one. Just took out that last one. Again, maybe you visually this makes more sense to you. Step 1, outcomes. Step 2, learning events. Step 3, technology. And then a key thing to keep in mind is a simple question. And we overcomplicate these things quite often. And that is, what is the learner supposed to learn? And I think the reason why I just want to pause with this question is I think we sometimes forget this simple question of what is the learner supposed to learn. And we overcomplicate it with the use of technology because it looks impressive, it looks fancy, but the message and the core concept that we're trying to convey gets lost if we don't simplify. Often we need to simplify things before we can amplify it. So think about this basic concept. Again, as I said, if this sticks, then that's great. This 3-step approach you need to follow. Just to give you an example of when we don't follow this 3-step approach and we first identify the technology. So let's say you discover a great e-learning tool online that you would like to use with your classroom. That becomes our focus. So now we're flipping this thing, we're going to flip it on its head, and we suddenly turn the technology into the first thing, right? I've got a cool tool that I want to use. Then the tool that I found, I now need to figure out how am I going to use this tool to try and teach them something. So we're probably not going to go straight to learning outcomes. We're going to kind of go into learning events. So how can I implement this tool? How can I use this tool? And then lastly, we ask ourselves, what learning outcomes can I get out of this? So this model, it's not that it doesn't work. It just moves the focus. And then if we do it like this, then technology is the add-on and not the add-in. Then people come back with that idea of, I don't have time to incorporate technology because it takes away from my other teaching time and my learning time. I hope that concept makes sense. If we do it this way around, then we often find ourselves in that position where, oh, but I can't do it because it's taking away teaching time. But if I take the way that I normally do things and I just use technology to integrate into that, suddenly I'm not taking any more time. I'm just adding value to what I'm doing. Right. So let's see what on earth are these learning events that I'm talking about. I don't know if anyone still remembers these. This is something I also only came across quite a bit later. But there's a guy, and I like his system. It's a simplified system. This Laurillard's learning events. As I said, some of you might have heard of it. Some of you might never have heard of it. It's quite simple. So let's have a look at what we mean by the Laurillard's learning events. So Laurillard talks about 5 different stages of learning that can take place. And again, when we look at these stages, we're not necessarily saying the one is better than the other one. These are just different things. And I integrated it into the ICT worksheet because I think it helps us to remember to teach at different levels and not to always teach in the same way. So acquisition is kind of the way that that a lot of us teach. It's just stand in front of the classroom and we teach them something, and learners need to listen and they need to try and acquire the information, right? Discovery becomes when there's a little bit more exploration involved. So, but sometimes it becomes difficult to do exploration if we haven't actually just done the acquisition yet. So it's hard to discover something if we don't have baseline information and knowledge about it. Then next comes dialogue. And I think this is such a valuable, but sometimes tricky thing to integrate into our teaching, allowing more discussion to happen, two-way discussion. forward discussion, however discussion you're going to have, but having collaboration, communication. We often talk something that we refer to in e-learning a lot when we talk about the 4 C's of 21st century, the 21st century skills. Then communication, collaboration, these things are incredibly important. We have to be able to collaborate and communicate. And moving forward, it's becoming absolutely invaluable skill for learners to develop at as soon as possible. The ability to collaborate effectively, which is taught and I believe learned at school level through things like dialogue, not just group work, but dialogue, having discussions. Then comes practice. So now take the things that we have acquired, we've discovered, we've had dialogue, and we actually practice these things. And lastly, my personal view, the most powerful of all the learning events is the idea of creation, creating something. So taking the things that I learned, the stuff that I learned, and actually applying them and creating something. Now, one of the reasons why I think Lorillard is such a useful thing for us to consider, again, this is gross generalization. This doesn't apply to everyone, of course. But I think one of the important things is we often find ourselves stuck in this area, acquisition, the teaching of things, and then practice, giving homework, as an example, just to really simplify it. And I don't know if we're necessarily doing the others as often as we can. But at the same time, what I think is such an important thing is when we start bringing technology on board, technology allows us to get a lot better at things like discovery. I mean, we've got the internet. You can search, right? So the ribbon is on the side. I'm not sure what that means. Lisa? Okay, I'm just going to go on. So discovery becomes incredibly powerful through the use of technology. The same applies to things like practice, and especially when it comes to creation. Here it becomes such a great tool that technology can take us to an entirely different level that we would never have before been able to do. But we aren't harnessing these things yet. And when I say we, this does not necessarily apply to everyone. I'm hoping there are people in this session that are really can blow our minds with some of the great things that they're doing. But I think when we look at Lorillard's learning events, it encourages us to reach out and expand beyond where we are. So again, just to kind of what I've seen personally. I think if you are seeing the ribbon, it's something that you can hide on your end, Lisa. Yes, there we go. Thank you. So I think a lot of these things and a lot of theory in general, what I found with theory is that theory reminds us of things that we neglect sometimes. So if this is something that you on reflecting on your own teaching practice, which is such a crucial thing for us to do, you discover that yes, this is what I do. I teach, and then I give homework, and that's kind of where we end up sticking to things. I think this is a challenge that you can take up, where we could say, but you know what, technology is going to allow me to add this element. Technology allows me to add dialogue as well. It becomes a bit more complicated, of course. So this is not necessarily the best place to start, but technology in terms of practice is incredible. And of course, as I said, creation, this is where technology, in my view, can really, really shine. So keep this in mind, shelve it for later. We're going to get back to it when we get to our lesson plan, when we're going to look at the lesson, the kind of lesson plan, the interactive lesson plan that we are working on. Right. So now we're going to get to specific e-learning theory. And I know we're going through a lot of things here. So please, if you've got questions in the chat, if there are things that you're uncertain that you need that you want me to clarify, raise your hand, and I'm more than happy to answer. We're just going to go through the next one, and then we're just going to Just pause for a second and then we'll go on again because I know there's a lot of information that's coming in now. The TPAC model. Now, the TPAC model can be quite confusing, but I'm going to really simplify it for us today so that we just get to the bottom line of what we want to understand within this TPAC model. Again, it's a great tool, like lots of theory, to shine or just to take a magnifying glass, spotlight, whatever you want to call it, and shine it on what we are doing so that we can reflect on what we are doing and try to ask ourselves, but where can I improve? Where are the areas that I really can start looking at improving? So what the TPAC model actually stands for is it stands for 3 domains that are critical parts of your integrating technology. So the first one that is absolutely essential is content knowledge. If we don't have content knowledge, then we really can't teach. It's as simple as that. I'm sure if you think back to your first year of teaching, I remember if I think back to my first year of teaching, I had to teach learners Macbeth. I had no idea what was going on in Macbeth, and this was a real struggle. I mean, I was a trained English teacher, but I had never read Macbeth before, and I'd never gone through Macbeth before, and not understanding the content of Macbeth made it such a difficult thing for me to teach the learners. But the longer that I taught, the more I taught Macbeth, the better my understanding of the content became, to the point where I can now teach Macbeth in my sleep. And I'm sure that the same applies to many of us, especially those of your experience. Then the part that we, I think, often focus on a lot during our studies, but then neglect to focus on as much when we get to when we get to implementing it, actually when we get to the classroom, because a lot of our focus when we move to the classroom moves to the content knowledge side of things, because we realize we need to sharpen up our content knowledge to become better teachers. So we sometimes neglect our pedagogical knowledge a little bit. Pedagogical knowledge, just in layman's terms, this is the way in which we teach. So our actual teaching, the craft of teaching. So that's what the pedagogical knowledge refers to. And then the last one that forms a very important part is the technical knowledge that we need to have. So our understanding of the various ICT tools that you can use. When you want to implement a new tool, let's say, for example, you want to use Quizlet in your classroom, you need to have the technical knowledge to understand how to set up a Quizlet, how to share a Quizlet, and you need to understand how learners will access a Quizlet. So that's the technical knowledge involved in things. If we want to take it back to a practical thing in our classroom, if I want to use a data projector, I need to know how to connect the data projector. I need to know how to share my screen to the data projector. Yes, the recording will be available, Renee. I need to have that kind of understanding. But the better my technical knowledge is, the better I'm going to be implementing it. So let's go back to the data projector. If I know how to extend my screen, this becomes quite nice because now I've got stuff ready to go on my laptop, but the learners don't see it. They only see what's on the screen. If I know how to freeze my screen, I can freeze it. I can change things up. I can unfreeze it. So these are small little technical things, and those technical things start tying into the other things that we need to get to. So this pedagogical content refers to teaching practices that work with certain content. Now, I was a language teacher, so I always go back to things that I know. If I look at the way that I taught poetry, there was a certain pedagogy around it, the activity of teaching that worked with poetry, but did not work with grammar. And I understood which one worked better. But it's not like I discovered it on day one. I stumbled my way through different methods of teaching, different kind of learning events that worked better for different content, and then kind of found something that worked for me. This is something we develop, I think, over time. Many of us have gotten to the point we've got a good understanding of how to teach certain content. The same applies to different areas of teaching, of course. Then the technical content side of things. So in terms of that, we need to understand the technical challenges of what content works with what technical thing. So certain things, if I look at that, videos is a perfect example. There are certain things that you can teach with videos incredibly well. Then there are other things that a video is just not going to get the content across. So there might be a different thing, but there's a different element that you need to understand. And here's the one, I think, where we go wrong the most. The most tricky one, I think, of the lot is the technical pedagogical element, the effective incorporation of technology in teaching. This is that whole thing of, I'm going to use technology, but I don't want it to disrupt my classroom. And a lot of teachers are afraid of that concept of, if I'm going to use technology, it's going to become disruptive. Learners are going to be disruptive in my classroom. If I'm going to allow my learners to use cell phones in the classroom, then they're going to do things on their phone that they're not supposed to. So there's a pedagogical element to integrating technology that you need to learn, that we need to develop. And it's something that, again, just like the pedagogical content knowledge that I spoke about, it took time for me as a teacher to discover what I felt was the best way to teach drama, the best way to teach poetry, the best way to teach grammar. The same applies to other areas. Discovering the best way to teach, understanding the best way to teach factorization, the best way to teach geometry, the best way to teach. So this takes time to discover. But in the same way, this technical pedagogical thing also takes time to discover. So just a simple example, when I started incorporating cell phones into my classroom, the first thing I had to figure out is, how do I make sure that learners aren't using these things irresponsibly? So I had them put their phones on the desk so that I can see where the phone is and I can see if they're using the phone. And I knew when they're allowed to use it, when they're not allowed to use it. And I would tell them, I would give them clear instructions. At one point, I had signs that I'd say, right, there we go. There's a sign on the board, little icons on my presentations, which basically meant that this is the moment that you're allowed to take your phone out and do X, Y, and Z with your phone. So these are little pedagogical tricks that you discover given time, once you've practiced it. But again, the very first time we stood in front of a classroom, we also didn't know how to do the basics that we've learned to do over many years. The very first time I opened up or had to do an online presentation like this, I did not know how to do things. I didn't have this little tool, for example, where I could draw arrows. There was a lot of things that I still also had to discover in terms of how we do things. So this is, in my opinion, on reflection, what I've seen from just experience in the field, the one area where teachers are still struggling the most is, how do I incorporate technology into my classroom, but in a way that I'm still teaching effectively? Because remember, the learning outcomes remains number one priority. And if that is not the case, then this can easily get out of hand and we can easily lose grip of this a little bit. Right. And then when we talk about TPAC, the whole lot, then we're talking about, if we're going one by one, we're looking at the technical, pedagogical, and content knowledge all kind of coming together. So the TPAC model, for me, most importantly, is a reminder that we need to bring three elements together if we want to be effective in integrating technology. We need to have the content knowledge, because I'm sure, maybe you haven't seen this before, but I have seen people who have fantastic technical knowledge, but they just don't know the material that they're teaching. And then the whole thing falls flat as well. So it's not just down to understanding how computers work. So what we have is we have some teachers who have brilliant content knowledge, brilliant management in classrooms, but they don't have the technical skills. And then we have other teachers who have fantastic technical skills, but might not have quite acquired the content knowledge yet. So this means we need to collaborate. We kind of need to sit together. I'll show you how to use the technical stuff. You teach me the content. And then we can actually all do this thing well. So if we look at a simple way of applying TPAC, when we look at the TK, PK, and CK, firstly, do I have the relevant technical expertise required to achieve my intended learning outcomes? So do I have the technical knowledge? Do I have the necessary pedagogical knowledge required to achieve the intended learning outcomes? Did I think about teaching strategies? Next, do I have the necessary content knowledge required to achieve intended learning outcomes? If you're going to open up the idea of exploration, learners go and scratch around on the internet and find different things on their own. This requires you to have solid content knowledge, because they might come up with questions that could be quite challenging, which is amazing if they're doing that. It's a wonderful thing. We should encourage that. And then, of course, if we're going to kind of look at these things, have I applied pedagogical thinking to my technical aspects? Remember what I said? Very important. Or am I thinking about these things? And then, have I used content expertise to enhance my pedagogy? So I think very often we are doing quite well in this area, but this area is one that we still need to improve quite a bit on. Right. So the TPAC one, we're going to come back to that again at the end. All of this is kind of feeding into our lesson plan. I hope you're all still with me. Can I just get some kind of a wave? Those of you that are on Teams, you can use a reaction. Those of you otherwise, you can. Right. Thank you. There's a hand. There we go. I see you all still with me. We will share the recordings with you, yes? Right, Renee, digital high five right back at you. Okay, cool. So we are all still keeping up. I hope it's all still making sense. The key thing, if nothing else, is it's all about reflecting. It's all about thinking what we are doing, actively asking ourselves how we can improve what we are doing and where we can still get better at this. Right. So just a quick request, all of you that put your hands up, unless you actually have a question, just put your hand down again. Just going to give you a second or two to put your hands down. If you leave your hand up, then I'm going to assume that you do have a question, which is also perfectly fine. You're welcome to ask if you don't know, if there's something that is unclear. Right, and as I said, this is the first time I actually saw the total. It's great to see that we've got over 160 people in this session. I really hope that some of the things that we are discussing here are things that you will relate to your colleagues as well, the concepts that we are talking about. Okay. Madeleine Miller, did you have a question? I see your hand is raised. Okay, there the hand goes down. Then Anel Isaacs, Miss Hendricks. Okay. I'm going to assume those are just let's go on with the session hands. Right. So what is the SAMR model? And for me, this is a real, I don't want to call it necessarily an eye-opener, but such a good way to think about the technology integration. When we talk about technology integration, we talk about, when we use the SAMR model, we talk about 4 different levels of technology integration. And the SAMR, it is an initialism for these 4 things. The first one being substitution. This is when we use technology. You are always welcome to use any of these things with your staff. You're also welcome to take the concepts and to reteach it to your staff if you want to. Right, so the substitution part of the use of technology. This is when we use technology as a direct substitution, where there's no actual functional change. Now that word functional becomes a little bit sticky, and you'll see why when we get to some examples of this. The next level we're talking about is the augmentation level. So now we're using technology as a substitute, but there's an improvement. So the technology we use has functional improvement. Now there's a lot of argument between the two of these things, because this presentation that I'm showing you is, I suppose it's substitution, because what I'm doing is I'm just substituting myself writing on a board. But it does technically have improvement, functional improvement, because look, it's nice the fact that things are coming in one at a time. It's not coming in as a one solid thing. I think sometimes when we design presentations and it's just a block of text there, I don't know if that necessarily counts as augmentation, because learners might as well just read that from the textbook. But now I'm adding a little bit more to it, so that it allows me to focus your attention, because we're talking about SAMR, and at this point you don't know what the M and the R stands for. So your focus is still on one area. I'm not having cognitive overload by just throwing it all out there in your face. And then, of course, now I've also got this little tool that I have so that I can highlight certain things, which is adding more kind of functional improvement to what I'm doing. So again, we're using an e-beam, things like that. We can kind of, in a way, say this is an improvement. But if you're just writing on your board, then it's not. But anyway, let's go on. So this is the enhancement section of things. When we're using this, we're using technology to enhance our teaching practice. And from what I've seen in visiting schools, this is kind of the ceiling where a lot of us are at the moment, right? So a lot of people who are curious about using technology and have gone into the idea of using technology are kind of at this point. We're substituting, and we've got some augmentation happening from time to time. So we are enhancing our teaching practice. And it's very important to understand, because I think this is where SAMR can also go wrong. Enhancement is a good thing. If you are doing this, that is great. That's not saying that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But what I hope that you can see today maybe is it opens up your mind to there is more that could be done. For example, when we go to modification, so now suddenly we're doing stuff that if we didn't have technology, we wouldn't be able to do it at all. We've got modification. So technically what you're seeing here, I could still be putting up different pictures and drawing different things in different colors and kind of getting the same thing happening. But when it comes to modification, we're talking about things that could not happen if we were not using technology. Then lastly, when we get to redefinition, and this is the part where things get really interesting, now we allow for the creation of things that would kind of just, we wouldn't have even thought of before we use technology. So between these two, the lines are blurred. There's no denying it. Between augmentation and substitution, there's a definite similarity. And between redefinition and modification, there's a definite similarity. And again, it's not like you are going to write a test and you need to identify which is which, because a lot of this is opinion based, whether you believe it is this or whether you believe it is that. But it is a wonderful way of asking myself, have I gotten to the point where I am transforming my education? Am I actually doing that? Remember, our ultimate goal is to transform our classrooms into these 21st learning centers, or whatever you want to call it. So transformation needs to take place. Transformation means things that would not have been able before using technology. There's a lot of what we're doing that is as I said, at the substitution augmentation level, we've kind of hit the ceiling and we're not necessarily moving beyond, because moving beyond means doing things that are different, sometimes remarkably different from what we've done in the past. So it is by far the most challenging part of this transformative journey, is to think differently. Right? So when we look at this, and I think this is a way that the SAMR model is, in my view, misinterpreted. When we look at this arrow, this idea that when we get here, we are now the winner because I can teach at a redefinition level. I'm amazing. Now, what I can tell you, and this is now from personal experience as well, if you try to teach too many things at the redefinition level, it falls flat, completely flat, in my opinion. We have to realize that in order to implement the SAMR model effectively, it goes both ways, right? So there are things that you're going to do at the redefinition level. There are things that you'll do at the substitution level. There are things that you will do with no technology at all, depending on what works. If you get to the point where you think like this, redefinition, we need to get everything there. You will find yourself back to square one, where we are flipping the way that we should think about things, and then technology becomes the focus, and the learning outcomes becomes the thing you think about last. So if we remember to keep this in mind, that there are certain things I'll do at the substitution level, certain things at the redefinition level, then we will be sure of the fact that we are actually putting the learning outcomes first. And then we ensure that technology is an add-in and not an add-on. Right. So let's have a look at some examples, because I don't think SAMR really makes sense until we look at some examples, and we're getting pretty close to the point where I'm going to ask you to participate. It's going to be interesting. I'm not going to lie. This is the part where I am in a little bit unknown territory because of the just sheer size of the people. We're pushing up to 200 attendees, which is wonderful to see. We're up to 176 now. I'm just worried at 4 o'clock we might end up losing a couple. So just something quickly for the practical side of things. Gilbert, I think just before we start with the practical thing, we can share this. We can just share the attendance register again for those people who joined a little bit later and might get kicked out at 4 o'clock. But not now. We'll get to the practical session in a bit. Right. So substitution. What constitutes a substitution? Let's have a look at a few examples. Firstly, when we use presentation software like Google Slides, PowerPoint, Prezi, a whole bunch of different things. Remember, there's a blurry line between substitution and augmentation, because I can easily make the argument that using this Google slide as I'm doing now is not just substituting what I would normally do. It's adding more to it than I would have been able to do. So we could argue for augmentation, but it's certainly not transforming what I'm doing. I'm still doing the whole teaching. I'm not doing it in front of you, but it's not that different. I mean, you're just hearing a disembodied voice talking over a presentation, but it's not that different from what was happening, what might be happening in a traditional classroom setup, right? Digital documents. So, for example, if I, instead of using textbooks, I'm now going to use PDFs. I'm going to use Word documents, going to use Google Docs. I use that in the place of a textbook. Again, this has the potential to add things into it when I'm using digital documents. So this is the potential to very quickly move from substitution to augmentation. Just in the chat quickly, let's see if anyone has an idea. If you, for example, want to change a digital document from just a substitution level to an augmentation level, any suggestions on a quick and easy way that you could potentially do that? A quick and easy way. We don't need like a long description. You can just enter in the chat. Right, adding a video, slideshow. So the key thing that I think both of you are kind of hinting at but not quite getting to is, whenever we have a digital document, the great thing is we can add links to it. The link to a video, the link to a slideshow, the link to a website, the link to wherever you need to do. So a link is immediately going to take a bland document and turn it into something more than it would have been otherwise. I promise you, if there's a link in the textbook, you can click on that thing until you're blue in the face, nothing will happen. So in other words, this is an immediate way where we move things from a substitution level to an augmentation level. Right? When we use smart classroom technology like an e-beam or a visualizer, these are forms of substitution that's going to allow you to add that immediately allows you to add extra things. Yes, as you said, hyperlinks. It's a quick and easy and incredibly effective way to change something into a augmented level of things. Now, the last thing, which is an interesting example, when you talk about videos, I've added a little asterisk there at the end when it comes to substitution, because it's a perfect example, just like the digital document, just like the presentation, of the way in which we use it defines the level of SAMR that we are using. So if I am going to say, I don't feel like teaching today, watch this 30-minute video of someone else teaching, I don't think anyone can argue with the fact that that is just substitution, and probably the worst kind of substitution that you can get. But if I go back to my example in the beginning, if I'm talking about a volcano and I show you a video of a volcano erupting, that adds something that you would not have been able to do with our technology. Then when we look at augmentation, I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker so we can get to the interesting, I suppose, the more juicy part of the session. When we use flip the classroom, a flipped classroom model, I send a video home to the learners, and that, or something that they need to read online before they get to the lesson. So this is augmentation. I'm changing things. One could even put the argument forward that this is kind of getting to the modification area of things. Again, a lot of SAMR is based on how you interpret it. Creating a web quest. So we pose certain questions with guided instructions on where to find the information. I'm putting these examples down specifically because a lot of us look at these things and we think that what we've done is we've really changed everything by using a flipped classroom and a web quest. But there are still so many more things we could potentially do. We use informative assessment is used to guide instruction. So I let my learners write a Google quiz. I check how they did, and I can actually use that to go back and change the next day and teach them. I use something like a Kahoot. When learners walk into the classroom, we'll play 10 minutes of Kahoot just so that I can get a sense of their baseline knowledge before I start teaching. I saw this used incredibly well in a classroom visit that I had, where a teacher used Kahoot to determine whether or not the learners understood shapes, the different shapes. And after playing the Kahoot, the kids almost all got it. And he said, well, clearly you understand shapes. Let's move on to volume, which just made sense. And then they did another Kahoot on that, and you could see there's a huge gap in their knowledge. And then, of course, once we start getting the cloud involved, then the augmentation, then we really start prepping ourselves to move into the redefinition things. Because the cloud, very importantly, regardless of which cloud service you're using, allows you to share. And it allows you to not only share, it allows you to collaborate. And this is where the true transformation starts happening in learning. When we are able to start collaborating and expanding on what we and changing learning and turning it into more of a social construct as well. Right. So let's have a look at modification, some of the examples that I have. And again, these are not the only examples. If you go and Google SAMR, you will find millions of different people saying millions of different things. So I'm just trying to synthesize some of it. But just show you some ideas of modification. So now we have learners are going to create the content and then they will upload it to a cloud-based platform where they can share it with their peers for peer assessment. So I write an essay or I write an answer to a question and I share it and we actually assess it, do peer assessment. To me, it's one of the strange things how incredibly scared we are of doing this within the educational environment. And the minute we start working, we open ourselves up for peer assessment and critique. But we can't, we're so scared of doing it when we're at school to get open up this concept and get used to it. But it's such a fundamental part of our everyday lives when we're working. So just a thought that I'll leave with you. Learners work in a collaborative workspace to complete group assignments. So now it suddenly becomes easier because it's not a case of we need to call around whose house can we meet at and who's got time and this one, now we need to find time. We can just work in a collaborative environment. When I get time, I'll do my thing. When you get time, you'll do your thing. And then when we get time, we'll come together and we'll discuss what we've done in a collaborative environment. And then here's something that I'm incredibly excited about. And we haven't got a workshop about this yet, but I'm definitely planning on doing something on this concept, assessment as learning, right? Not just assessment of learning, which is the one we all know, the concept of summative assessment, not just assessment for learning, when we, now the words out of my head, formative assessment, but assessment as learning, which is an incredibly interesting new one that's gaining traction now. Learners are enabled to create their own formative assessments, which they can then share with their peers, which is a great kind of trick that we can do. And technology makes this easy. I mean, you can do this on a piece of paper as well. This is not that you have to use technology. It just becomes so much easier and better and more interesting when we use technology. And then redefinition, just to leave some ideas with you. Now, this is the part where, again, there's a murky area between redefinition and modification, and you'll see. So learning happens through content creation, which is driven by the use of digital tools. So this becomes a big part. We're not just writing tests, we're actually creating things. We're making new things. And there's a big drive towards this idea of it's your project-based learning concepts. And technology can really enhance that. Learners create online portfolios of content, which can then be shared, and not just internally, but externally, so that you open yourself up to the world outside. All the kids these days want to be content creators. They want to become famous on Instagram, etc., etc. And there's a lot of money to be made in that. There's a future and a career in that. And content creation is becoming an incredibly important element, digital content creation. So let's help them. Then, and this is the part that gets very interesting, that we could potentially do, which the world is slowly opening up towards, is the connecting with learners worldwide in a linear or non-linear way, where you actually, and I remember I did this once, twice in my classrooms, where we connected with classrooms across the globe. And I just sat back and had my learners have discussions and talk to these kids about their experiences. And they asked the learners in my class about my learners' experiences to grow. And I mean, it was a curriculum-based thing, because my learners were engaging with learners from Germany, asking them questions about I remember that it was a little bit strange. I had a difficult time finding classroom, but we were talking about the Holocaust and World War, etc. And they were doing some kind of research thing on South Africa. So it was a very interesting opportunity to create. But the same thing applies when we get to blogging, etc., etc., connecting to the world out there. So this becomes a very strange thing. So now we're going to get to the activity. Gilbert has shared the link to the register. So those of you who are, yes, exactly as Mr. Walker has said, democratizing the classroom, which is a interesting concept that we might be moving towards. We're all talking about the different revolutions, the fourth, the fifth, whatever the case might be, but we need to reimagine these things. And this is, again, does sound a little bit like pie in the sky thinking, but we need to have kind of goals to aspire to move beyond, as I said, that ceiling that we've hit with substitution and augmentation. What else could still potentially happen? So now we're going to have a look at SAMR, right? Let's use this example very quickly. I'm going to just take something simple from a geography perspective. So here we've got substitution. Learners use Google Earth to locate a place instead of using a printed map. Simple substitution. We have to be able to use Google Earth and Google Maps these days. It's becoming an absolutely integral part of how we find anything. As my colleague Gilbert can attest to, if I did not have Google Maps, I would not be able to find my own house. Then augmentation, now we're looking at learners make use of tools in Google Earth to measure the distance between places. Suddenly, measurement becomes more real. It's not just this abstract number that I'm trying to apply to something else. And one thing I really want to highlight here is, and I don't think I mentioned it in enough detail when we looked at SAMR, is if we take this breakdown here, and this is why we are much more comfortable with substitution and augmentation, because it is a teacher-driven thing. When we look at substitution augmentation, it's still the teacher drives the learning. When we start moving to modification and redefinition, so now I use an internet search or use internet search tools for research on locations on Google Earth, and use layers that can embed information on that. So I have to find my own information. I have to embed my own information on top of Google Earth. You can do that. You can do very interesting things using Google Earth and using different tools to do that. And then when we get to the redefinition, again, this is a content creation driven concept. Now I use tools to create videos or audio, and I can use that to create a guided tour of locations on Google Earth. Now, the same thing can apply to many different things. And the challenge is to sit down, take a topic, and ask yourself, how can I apply substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition to the same topic? And again, the learning outcomes are the key thing. So I have to ask myself, what kind of learning outcomes will be are important here? There's other stuff that'll be learned in this instance, but I also need to make sure that I focus on the learning outcomes in this concept. Now we're going to go to the activity. So over here, you'll see there's a QR code. And this is the part that I'm going to be very interested to see how it goes. There's a QR code and there's a bit.ly link. Let me just quickly paste the bit.ly link in the chat room. Those of you who know how Jamboard works, you can jump on there so long. So there's the bit.ly link. Let me just turn that into a link. I see it's not a link. Right, so click on that link and it'll take you to a Jamboard. On that Jamboard, you'll see that I've basically created a template that looks like that previous slide that I just showed you. Right, I see there are some people in already. More people are popping in, more people are popping in. More and more. Now it's growing quite quickly. I'm not 100% sure what the limit is on Jamboard, so it is going to be a bit of a first come, first serve. All right, I'm going to leave that QR code there for a second. Right, so Jamboard is from what I saw now, we can have a total of 50 people on it. So if you're one of the first 50, great. If you missed it, that's okay. You can have a look at what we are going to be doing. So on the Jamboard, what I want you to do, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about this. You can also obviously discuss this and use the chat board. What I want you to do is the first slide we have is learning content. Now, what you need to do is over here, you'll see I can add a sticky note. Right? So that little icon over there, I click on that, I add my sticky note, and I'm going to say substitution. I'll just say using a PDF, save. And I will move that into substitution because that's where it needs to go. So try and think of a couple of different ways that you can use technology at a substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition level when we are learning content. Thanks. There's one person who's added something. And I always find it interesting that you'll see how quickly it becomes clear that we're all very comfortable with substitution because we immediately know how to substitute. Okay, everyone's saying PowerPoint. Now we need different ideas. PowerPoint is now, there we go. Now we've got a video. Right, it seems someone decided to clear the frame. Okay, I think I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it was an interesting. I don't know who decided to clear the frame now. But this is a perfect example of yes. I suppose this is a great example of where the pedagogy element comes in. I needed to warn you to not clear the frame, but unfortunately, as we know with learners, the minute that I tell you don't clear the frame, someone will click on clear the frame. Right. So a suggestion for augmentation: a teacher records a video or a voice, and the learner does instead. So if we want to have another example of, let's say, something like when we get to the modification redefinition, a lot of people are using something like Flip, the old Flip grid for video content. But it's an interesting concept because as a teacher, I can ask a question, and again, it becomes a learner-driven thing because learners respond to that question, and suddenly all of those answers appear. Here's another example of when we get to the modification redefinition, something that I use all the time as a language teacher is I would ask a question. I would ask a literary essay question, 400 words, 450 words, and then ask all the learners to respond to that. And you would have access to everyone else's response once you have written your response. I did not give them a memo. They basically wrote their own memo. So at the end of the exercise, you had access to 40 different essays. Now the challenge becomes, and this is where education is also becoming interesting for me. Now the challenge becomes for the learner being able to understand which of these is good. And unless you have gone through the process of going through the content, understanding content, you will not be able to discern a good essay from a bad essay. The same thing applies to the new big buzzword that people are talking about, this AI that's around. If you do not understand the content well enough, you will not know whether or not the response that the AI gave you was good or bad. So that moves to a different type of level of understanding content. Because now, if we go back to our Bloom's taxonomy and all those things, now it's not just about learning rote learning, but it's about really analyzing and getting to the nitty-gritty. Right. So we're going to move to the next frame. If you please note over here at the top, you'll see there's a button that you can press to move to the next frame. Whoever accidentally cleared the frame last time, please don't do this again. So there's a button there that says clear frame. Do not click on the clear frame button, please. And let's see what we can think of when we do assessment. Again, substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition. What are some ideas that we have? Gilbert complained that I tried to add a sticky, so I won't do it again. So now it's your opportunity. I'll get the ball rolling. Even though I know there's no such thing as Google Quiz. Yes, we will share the recording. So we'll take everyone who completed the register, and I know there's a lot of people that are struggling with power outages, so we will share the recording far and wide. What else can we do with assessment? This is the part where if you are uncertain, don't worry. You can just put down the different tools that you know. Some of them will fall under augmentation. Some of them will fall under modification. Right. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Lisa. And remember that link that we shared in the beginning? You're welcome to join any session on there. And please encourage our colleagues who are not here to also join these sessions. Right? We want to kind of, is there anyone who's got any ideas for the redefinition? Because this is always the kind of part where we're getting a little bit skeptical. I don't know if it's necessarily in the redefinition category, but we could have a group, create a website with a variety of resources. There's videos, there's presentations, etc., that they use to present contents. Basically like a digital portfolio with all sorts of different little things inside of it. Right. The one thing that is very important, and for me, the most important take home from this exercise is two things. All of us can, and now I'm going to do the one thing that I asked you not to do. I'm going to clear the frame. All of us can go, and not all of us, but those of us that are using technology quite a bit can go and put down things here for substitution, and probably quite a few things for augmentation as well. Where we struggle is, and we can do the same for learning content, where we struggle is when we try to think of what could we do at the modification and what could we do at the redefinition level. So I'm going to put that as a challenge to those of you in the session. Take a topic and then ask yourself, but what could I do at the different levels? Right, collaborate on a project in an LMS. Perfect example of how we start doing assessment and start changing it. Or project-based learning concepts. Start really moving towards modification and redefinition. Remember, the bottom, the very simple way of understanding it, I've often said, is substitution and augmentation is a teacher-driven, teacher-focused thing. Modification and redefinition is a learner-centered approach. So this is a really kind of basic way of understanding it. The one is teacher-driven, the other one is learner-driven. So when we're doing these things. And again, remember what we said. There's an arrow. Let me just clear some of these things. The arrow goes both ways. It's not only one way. Okay, so now we're going to look at, remember I said I want to leave you with something that's going to make your life hopefully a little bit easier going forward. So first, before I give you the copy, let's go and explore what this thing looks like. So what we've done is we've come up with a basic template. And remember, the template's idea is not to, is specifically to help you reflect, to help you consider things that you're doing. Sorry, just before I go on, I actually haven't even paused to give people the opportunity to ask a question. I see Danelle Polyblank has her hand up. I'm going to just allow your mic. If you have a question, you are welcome to ask. If you don't, you're welcome to put down your hand. Okay, no worries. Are we all still with me? Are we all ready to go with the last part of things? Just to before we get to this last part, I'm going to jump right up back to the second slide, just to remind you about where we are and what we're doing, what we're looking at. Remember, we ultimately want to solve this problem, because this is a problem that I've been picking up, is e-learning is used as an add-on and not as an add-in. What we did is we looked at these models, the TPAC model and the SAMR model. Now we're going to see how we can implement these things into our digital lesson plan with the idea of going and trying to fix this so that we can get better at making e-learning an add-in as opposed to an add-on. Right, so if you're all with me on that concept, let's have a look at the lesson template that we've come up with, right? And I'm going to help you copy this in a second or two. So it is a Google Doc for a couple of reasons. You are welcome to download it, but then you're going to lose a lot of the functionality of this. I don't think it's going to convert that well to a Word document, but let me show you how it works. It's very simple. We've got a couple of, all of these fields are blank fields that you need to complete. So I'm just going to, there's an example. Let's say we're going to teach grade 10. I'm teaching English home language. And my topic is poetry. Right, I'm not going to specify which poem. And the technology required for this one, I'm going to need a projector or a TV, same kind of effect. And I'm going to need some learner devices. And in this instance, learner devices could be tablets, it could be laptops, it could be cell phones. And it's not necessarily a case of one-to-one. It really depends on what you do. Remember, this document is a reflective document where you are able to think about what you need to do. So my learning outcomes is I want learners should understand poem X. I don't know what poem X is going to be. And that's kind of it, really. I want them to understand poem X, and I want them to be able to respond to questions on it. I'm keeping it very simple. Obviously, the learning outcomes, you can flesh it out a lot more. So my activities, my pre-activities, I will share the poem and background on the poet before the lesson. So I'm going to give them this to take home. Depending on the technology that I want, I'm going to say in this instance, I want them to use their learner devices because I'm going to share on an LMS with it. Whatever LMS you might use, Google Classroom or MS Teams or whatever you want to use. So this is just a simple kind of substitution type of thing because I'm going to share a couple of links with them. This could easily be something else. So what we've done for each of these, for the pre-lesson, you'll see there's an activity, there's a technology that's involved, and there's the level of SAMR that we're using, or substitution, augmentation, modification, or redefinition. So in this instance, this is just simple substitution. So this is the technology I need, projected or TV or learner devices, nothing more. Then during the lesson, now I'm going to get to the different, what I want to do in this lesson. So if you need to add more, you can simply press tab and it adds more. If you only have 2 activities, you can right click and say delete row. It's a simple, it's not a complicated tool in that sense. So if I just press tab at the end of this one, it gives me a new row with all the various things implemented there already. So this lesson, the event that I have is going to be, the first one is I want to have a dialogue, which is kind of a weird way to do it around because I haven't actually done acquisition yet. So what I want to do is I'm going to divide. Right, I'm just going to do this quickly because I did kind of write down some ideas beforehand. I'm going to divide them into random groups. I'm going to use Flippity, and each group will discuss a stanza. Just take that each. Each group discusses a stanza. So they're going to, in their groups, try and make sense of the stanza. So for this, I'm going to need my projector because I'm going to use a tool called Flippity to kind of do the heavy lifting of putting them into groups for me, because I don't want to try and do this on my own. If you haven't used Flippity before, it's a very cool tool. Hopefully at some point we'll make a short little explainer video because it's sort of a whole workshop for it. But in short, what it does random name selection for you. Actually, Flippity has a bunch of things on it, so go check it out. It's quite cool. This one, I could argue that it changes, it goes into a higher level of things. I'm not going to really get into that. Let's just make it a simple little augmentation because what it does is it takes away some of the effort of more classroom management than anything else here. Then I'm going to go through the good old-fashioned acquisition, and I'm going to go and teach the poem, and I'll use my projector doing this. So this is substitution again. So you'll see, even though I have ideas of what I could be doing, I'm not trying at any point to just teach all of it at the redefinition level, because it doesn't, in my opinion, necessarily make sense to do that, to try and do everything at that level. So I'm kind of what I did, and I think normally what we do is we reverse these. We'll first teach the poem and then have some dialogue. But from my personal experience, this worked. I did this kind of thing with almost all my poetry, and it worked incredibly well, especially if the learners went and did the effort beforehand and actually read the poem and did some research on the poem and had an idea of what the poem was about. So then when they got to class, they could have a good discussion about what the poem is. And then by the time I'm teaching the poem and the acquisition part happens, they actually enter the learning with incredibly good baseline understanding and knowledge. So now I'm actually just filling in the blanks as opposed to the whole poem being a blank. Just the kind of way that I went about doing things. Maybe there are some other language teachers in here. Oh yes, the technology, Gilbert reminded me, I need a teacher laptop as well. Right, I need something to connect to my projector. Right, so here I'm going to teach the poem using a Google slide probably. I could, if I want to, show them a video from YouTube. Depending on the poem, there's nice stuff on there. You just give them a different flavor than just what I'm doing, but timing becomes important, whether or not I'll be able to fit all of these things in. Again, this requires planning. And then lastly, what I want to do is I'm going to do a kind of creation type thing that they'll do here at the end. So now learners are divided into groups again. I'll use Flippity for this as well. And they will create questions. Or let's say, what did I say here? They will compile questions for each other. Right, so now they'll compile questions for each other and they will submit online. Teacher will curate and select and distribute. Wait, that's going to be part of the post lesson. So here what they do is they actually get together and they're now supposed to come up with questions on their own. Those questions are not just going to be written down on a piece of paper, because I don't have the time to go and take all of those questions and try and copy and paste it. They're not going to email it to me. Again, I don't want to copy and paste it. I'm going to use a clever little tool where they can just submit questions and answers to me, just a multiple choice type thing, and it will automatically compile into a quiz that I can then send to them. So for this, we need learner devices, because they will have to be able to send this to me. And then their activity is they will then do these questions. Let's say they will answer these questions and submit. Answer these questions, plus I'll add some questions as well, teacher questions, and return, or just leave it like that, right? So the technology used again, we're going to use learner devices again, and this is again happening at more of an augmentation level, because it is a quiz. They're not doing anything more than a quiz. The nice thing, and the reason why I said a quiz is always kind of somewhere between augmentation and substitution, is the nice thing about this is the instant feedback that you get. So I answer a question and I immediately know whether or not I'm right or wrong. I can immediately jump back to the content and have a look so that I know what's going on. So technically what I'm doing in this instance, I'm using the assessment as learning concept, and here I'm using assessment for learning. None of this is summative assessment, so this is all part of the learning process still, that I'm using here. This is just to show you. This is just to show you an idea of how you use this thing. So I thought the best way to show you is to go and kind of complete this form in front of you. The key areas of this form for me is obviously the SAMR one, because it will bring the theory of e-learning integration forefront, right? Yes, Flippity is free as far as I know. I think there might be paid for elements to it, but the parts that I've used and that I've used so far aren't paid for. But there's a ton of things. I mostly use Flippity for the name selector elements. I haven't really played too much with a lot of the other things, but there are great other tools in there as well. So this, as I said, just to bring us back to what we were discussing here, the value of this thing is that firstly, from a technical side and the theory side of implementing e-learning, it reminds us of the SAMR levels, and it reminds us of implementing SAMR at different levels. And then from a pedagogical side, it just reminds us of this basic concept that I think we often neglect, and that is having a pre-lesson idea of things, having things that are going to happen during the lesson, and having post-lesson activities. And not just post-lesson activities, just dish out homework, and pre-lesson activities is there to do homework for today. Think about it a little bit more carefully than just that. And then the other thing that's also part of the pedagogy of this is the idea of the learning events and cycling through learning events, and not just doing everything at an acquisition level, but trying to consider how can I use different levels. What's the one thing that we also spoke about at length that we haven't brought in at all? Can anyone? I hope you still remember. We're getting to the end of our session now. I hope we can still remember all the things we spoke about. What is the one thing I haven't brought in yet? Now there's deathly silence. Yes, you're right, Renee. I haven't actually looked at the redefinition example. But in terms of the theory, the one thing I have not brought in yet is here on the second page, and that is TPAC. Reflection using TPAC as a tool. Right. So when we get to TPAC, the way that I've always looked at TPAC is it's a great way of assessing what I've done. And we don't do this often enough. We don't go after we taught a lesson and ask ourselves, what went well, what didn't go well, what can I improve on next time? Because we're always rushed. And I know this is the thing about a teacher, we always are moving on to the next thing. So in this instance, what we have here is I've got 6 different areas for TPAC that you can just kind of do quick self-assessment for when you're done with a lesson, especially when you are going to. And this is the thing about technology I've found. When you do the hard yards now, it becomes so much easier in the future. Because if you spend time planning this, or as I think it was Renee as well mentioned, talking to a staff about it, if you adopt this or something similar to this as a staff, and you start building these kind of lessons templates on this, and you can start assessing yourself, then you know when you're doing it again, where do I need to improve on? So technical knowledge, if I'm going to teach this lesson and I can't get my projector to work properly, I'm going to say I need improvement. I definitely need to do it better. Or I'm going to say, well, let's say we're going to leave it at that. Pedagogical knowledge, I was able to manage the group discussions well. It wasn't chaotic, and I was able, my content knowledge, I know almost everything about the poem, but what I also did is I allowed my learners to do research on the poem beforehand. So now my kids are asking me questions that I can't answer. So maybe adequate to task. We'll leave it at that. Then we have a look at some of these other things, technical content. So the technical content, was I able to do this? Yes, it was adequate to task. Technical pedagogical, could I do everything? Were the kids able to use their cell phones effectively? Was it a bit of a struggle to manage this? It actually went really well. And then lastly, pedagogical content. This element, is this going, did I have an effective teaching strategy to teach this? Yes, I think it worked very well. So this is just as a reflection. And all that this does, the whole purpose of this ICT integration lesson plan is to just allow you to do a little bit more reflection before you teach, to think a little bit about the teaching, your practice, the teaching practice specifically, to consider how you integrate technology and at what level we are integrating technology. So that is the purpose of this ICT integration worksheet. Right, now, how do you get your hands on this? I hope this looks like something that you think you're going to be able to use. But let's see how we can use this. And remember, you're welcome to take the idea and to make it your own and to build your own type of lesson plan as well. Right. So over here, if you scan this QR code, you will make a copy of the lesson plan. If you take this bit.ly, which I will now post in the, I hope it still works. The bit.ly I'm going to post in the chat. Just give me a second. Right, so there's the bit.ly. You can also, if you see it on the screen, you can just type it as well. Right. So if you click on that link, just give me a second. I'm just going to leave the QR code up for a second or two longer. But if you click on that link, you'll see it takes you to a thing that says copy document. Now, the one drawback of this is you must have a Google account in order to access it. What we will do is I will attach a PDF version of it to the email that we send out to all participants if you want that. Obviously, the PDF version will not have drop downs or anything like that. So you're going to have to write that in manually. So it does lose that functionality, which is unfortunate. But you'll see once you've clicked on it, it'll show you a screen that looks like this. Would you like to make a copy of ICT Integration Worksheet? If I click on Make a Copy, it will then make a copy of that ICT Integration Worksheet. You'll see it as a blank one. So you get to do on this thing whatever you want to do. It is not going to affect the template in any way. I just realized I haven't actually posted the link yet. Sorry, my bad. So there's the link. It has been posted. I thought it had already posted. So you will just go through that process again. I just want to delete this one very quickly. All right, so if you click on that link, it'll take you to copy the document. Would you like to make a copy of ICT Integration Worksheet? You just simply click on this Make a Copy. What it'll do is it'll make a copy of this document and put it in your Google Drive root folder. So if you don't want it there, you'll have to move it. But what it also does, you don't have to go and remember this thing forever, because what's part of this document are two things. One is a link that says make a copy. So you can obviously go and say and copy this thing, but then it copies it with all the content that's in there already. If you click on this make a copy, it just gives you a blank one over and over again. That's the idea behind it. And then if you're uncertain, if you forgot how it actually works, you can click on this how. And I've also made like a 5-minute video on how this worksheet works, how to fill it in, what you're supposed to do, etc., etc. Are there any questions at this point in time? Because that does bring us to the end of our session. I'm still going to wrap it up a little bit, but I know this is a lot of information, and I hope you've been able to wrap your head around it. But this is the moment that you can ask a question if you have any questions. Thank you. Gilbert has now also shared the right. Sanet, just to answer that question, when you ask for a list of apps ideas to use for newbies, to use for foundation phase teachers, yes, there's the teacher sidekick that Gilbert just mentioned. The key thing is have a look at the training sessions that are coming up. What I always say, and I think the most important thing with, yes, you can print the lesson plan, of course. It is a document, normal document. So once you've actually filled in the document, so for example, if I take this one, and I can just go to print, that option of printing it. Obviously, the minute that you print it, then I think it goes without saying you can't click on any of the drop downs anymore, and the links to the make a copy, etc., won't work. But yes, you can print it. You can do anything like that that you need to do with it. Just to get back to that question that Sanet had, I think the key thing, Sanet, that to understand when we look at that is we need to, if you join the various sessions that we have, there are sessions that are more focused on foundation phase. We do have a couple of things in the pipelines as well that we are working on that does focus on foundation phase. But the general idea is as soon as you start adopting a different mindset around the integration of technology, you start discovering the tools that get you to the point that you want to be. There's a whole bunch of different tools, but if we need to understand how to implement the tools rather than just what the tools are. So I'm always a little bit hesitant of those long lists of tools that you can. So I'm always a little bit hesitant of the long list of tools that you can use because unless we understand the theory behind it, unless we understand that the pedagogy behind implementing these tools effectively, it doesn't necessarily get us to where we want to be. So just to show you, just to wrap up, I think that really ties into what we want to talk about, or what we've been trying to, the idea that we've been trying to get across. It's this concept that we had of technology as an add-in, not an add-on, where we have to focus on our learning outcomes. And it's wonderful if you're asking the questions because you're kind of getting to the point that you understand how you integrate it. Now you want to know what tools are available. But it's a process of getting there. So the teacher sidekick that Gilbert mentioned, I don't know if you have the link for that as well, Gilbert, if you could just post that. It's a compilation of different tools for that applies across the different phases that you can use for when you're working, when you're trying to integrate technology. I know there's a session, I can't remember exactly what that session is, about digital puzzles, which is very much focused on foundation phase that they are going to present again, which has lots of cool little tools. Flippity, the one that I spoke about, has great little tools that you could use for foundation phase learners as well. Right, thank you, Gilbert, has shared the link to the teacher sidekick. In conclusion, to wrap up what we're talking about in this session, and please don't quite jump off yet. I need to share the link where you do your feedback. So just give me 5 more seconds. In conclusion, we need to remember that e-learning has to be used as an add-in, not an add-on. The TPAC model and the SAMR model gives us frameworks that we can use in order to make sense of that concept. But to make things easier for you, or that's what I hope it does, is we have this digital lesson plan that will keep on reminding you about these two, the TPAC and the SAMR model, with the intention that you will understand that it all starts with learning outcomes, and it's all about the learning outcomes, identifying learning events that will get me to those learning outcomes, and then finding the technology that's going to help me do that. So with that said, thank you very much. I hope this has been a worthwhile session. It's wonderful to see so many people in the session, despite some of the struggles that we have with load shedding, with connectivity, whatever we might have. I think there's still an incredibly positive attitude towards how we can continue growing our use of technology in the province, and that is a really encouraging thing to see. One last thing that I just ask, I'm going to share a link to an incredibly short feedback form. If you would be so kind as to just complete that feedback, we find it a really valuable, so that we can try and have a look at what we are doing and always try and get better at what we do. Reflecting on a practice is a key thing, I think, that we as teachers should always try and do as much as we possibly can, right? So there is the link. Thank you, Mr. Bowers, for that positive feedback. Now, please go do that positive feedback on the form as well. And if you have not completed the attendance register, make sure that you complete that attendance register. We will use that attendance register naturally we will use that attendance register and send out the recordings and the various links. So if you need the link to copy the digital lesson template, I'm just going to add that one here at the bottom as well. And then a final note, just before we say farewell. We really look forward to seeing you in more of these Dovetail Essentials. Remember that you can pre-register for all of them on that link, and you can pre-register for all other sessions on that link as well. I think this has been a great start to the Dovetail Essentials sessions, and I really look forward to seeing all of you back for the next one as well.